Not in my town, boy. Those 5 words hung in the air of a quiet suburban street on a Tuesday afternoon, spoken by a man with a badge and a gun and the absolute certainty that he was untouchable, and they would ultimately become the 5 words that destroyed everything he had ever built. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back 40 minutes to where this story actually begins, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what was sitting in that black Chevy Tahoe on Sycamore Court in the heart of Maplewood Estates. His name was Darius Webb, and he was 43 years old, and he had been waiting in that car since just after noon with the particular stillness of a man who had learned over 12 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation that patience was not a personality trait, it was a weapon, and he had sharpened it to a very fine edge. Darius had deep brown skin and a shaved head that caught the filtered afternoon light, and he was wearing an Italian wool suit that had been tailored specifically to conceal the Sig Sauer P229 holstered under his left arm. And if you had walked past his car on the street, you would have noticed none of that, because Darius Webb did not want to be noticed. That was, in fact, the entire point. On the passenger seat beside him, a surveillance folder marked "Confidential" in red block letters, a pair of high-powered binoculars, and a cup of coffee that had been hot approximately 90 minutes ago and was now something closer to room temperature disappointment. He took a sip of it anyway, grimaced, and set it back down without taking his eyes off the house 3 doors up the street. Maplewood Estates was the kind of neighborhood that cost $500,000 to buy into and another $100,000 a year to maintain the illusion that nothing bad ever happened there. The lawns were cut with geometric precision. The American flags hung from their porch poles with the practiced casualness of people who had never once questioned their right to fly them. The streets were so quiet on a Tuesday afternoon that you could hear the sprinklers cycling on the Henderson's side yard from half a block away. The demographic breakdown of Maplewood Estates, according to the last census, was 97% white, which meant that the black man in the government-plated Tahoe was already, simply by existing in that zip code, a data point that someone was going to want explained. Darius knew this. He had known it before he parked. It was not a surprise. It was simply a variable he had already calculated into his operational planning, the same way he had calculated the angle of sunlight on the target's front windows, and the average response time of the Maplewood Police Department, and the 47 other small factors that separated a successful surveillance operation from a compromised one. He was 18 months into a federal investigation targeting Alderman Victor Crane, the city's longest-serving elected official. A man who appeared at every ribbon cutting and every charity gala, and every neighborhood watch meeting with his wide, confident smile and his expensive handshake, and who had, according to 18 months of wire intercepts and financial forensics, been laundering cartel money through city rezoning contracts with the kind of brazen efficiency that only comes from believing you are completely untouchable. Today was the day the courier was supposed to arrive. The money drop that would close the loop. The moment that would turn 18 months of careful work into a federal conviction. Darius checked his watch. 2:04 p.m. His partner, Special Agent Serena Okafor, was 2 blocks east in a white surveillance van. The D.C. field office was listening live. Darius was wearing a wire, a thin transmitter taped to his chest beneath his shirt, picking up everything. Everything was in position. He took another sip of the cold coffee, settled back into his seat, and watched the street. Then the rearview mirror caught a flash of white and blue. The cruiser turned onto Sycamore Court at the kind of deliberate predatory crawl that police officers use when they have already decided something is wrong and are simply taking their time getting to the part where they do something about it. Unit 317 of the Maplewood Police Department rolled to a stop 2 car lengths behind the Tahoe, and the engine stayed running, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Darius did not turn around, did not. He watched the mirrors. The driver's door opened first, and the man who stepped out was built like someone had assembled him from spare parts of a different era, broad across the chest, heavy in the shoulders, moving with the specific rolling swagger of a man who had spent so many years being the biggest presence in every room he entered that he had stopped being able to walk any other way. Officer Brad Tanner was in his late 40s with platinum blonde hair buzzed close to his skull, and a jawline that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime around 1987 and hadn't softened since. His sunglasses reflected the suburban afternoon glare. His thumbs were hooked near his belt in the universal posture of a man who wanted everyone watching to understand that he was in charge of this particular stretch of asphalt and everything on it. The passenger door opened a few seconds later, and Officer Casey Marsh stepped out looking like someone who had arrived at a party and already suspected she'd made a mistake coming. She was mid-20s, her uniform a half size too large across the shoulders, and her hand hovered near her radio with the nervous precision of someone trying to appear ready, while simultaneously hoping nothing happened that would require her to actually be ready. She trailed Tanner by several steps, scanning the street with darting eyes, and even from a distance, and through a rearview mirror, you could see the specific discomfort of a person who was doing the math on a situation and not liking the answer they kept arriving at. Darius placed his hands at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, fingers spread and clearly visible, and lowered the driver's side window as Tanner approached. He had done this before. Not this exact situation. The badge was new. The suit was new. The 12 years of federal service were new. But the fundamental experience of being a black man in a parked car, watching a white officer walk toward him with his chest puffed out and his decision already made, that was not new at all. That was as familiar as the cold coffee and the afternoon light. Tanner reached the window and leaned down one meaty hand flat on the roof and peered through his aviators into the interior of the Tahoe with the slow, deliberate scan of a man looking for something he fully expected to find. He did not say good afternoon. He did not say hello. He did not say, "Can I help you?" or "Is everything okay?" or any of the dozens of opening phrases that would have indicated he was approaching this interaction with even the most basic professional neutrality. What he said, leaning on the roof of a federal government vehicle, on an active surveillance operation on a Tuesday afternoon in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, was simply this: license and registration. No preamble, no context. Just the command delivered with the flat authority of a man who had been saying it for 20 years and had never once had reason to question whether he was directing it at the right person. Darius turned his head slowly. He kept his voice at the calibrated, even baritone he used when talking to people who were holding weapons and making poor decisions. He said calmly and clearly that it was a good afternoon, and he asked whether there was a problem. Tanner said it again louder this time. License and registration. And "I'm working," Darius said, keeping his hands exactly where they were and his voice exactly where it needed to be. Level. Unhurried. The voice of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds were being recorded and that every word he said was going to matter enormously later. "I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them now. This was the protocol. Declare. Describe. Do not move without warning. Give the officer every possible opportunity to de-escalate. Give the system every possible chance to work the way it was supposed to work." Tanner's hand dropped to his holster. The snap of the retention strap being thumbed open was a small sound, but a very loud one in the quiet of the afternoon. "Don't move a muscle," Tanner said. "I didn't ask for a life story. I asked for ID." "I understand," Darius said. "I am identifying myself as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am on an active surveillance operation. If I exit the vehicle, I break cover on an ongoing federal case." Tanner laughed. It was a short barking sound with nothing warm in it. He leaned further through the window, and Darius could smell the coffee on his breath, and Tanner said that he had received reports of break-ins in this area, and that Darius fit the description. Darius held the silence for just a moment. Then he asked very quietly which description that was exactly the one that said, "Black male, sitting in a legally parked vehicle in a residential area." The vein in Tanner's neck jumped. His face went a shade of red that was not healthy in a man of his age and weight. He grabbed the door handle with both hands and yanked, found it locked, and the sound of his frustration came out as something that had moved well past professional authority and into something more personal, more ugly. "Open this door," Tanner said, "or I break the window." From the passenger side of the cruiser, Casey Marsh took a half step forward. "Brad," she said, her voice careful and low. "He said he's a Fed. Maybe let him show the ID first." "Stay out of it," Marsh Tanner said without looking at her. Darius made the calculation in approximately 3 seconds. If he refused, Tanner would follow through on the window, drag him out, and the physical confrontation would be larger, louder, and more dangerous. If he complied, he lost control of the operation, but he saved the glass, saved his shoulder, and most importantly kept himself alive while the wire kept recording. He pressed the unlock button. "Okay," he said, his voice dropping half an octave into something cooler and more precise. "I am unlocking the door. I am stepping out. I need you to listen very carefully to what I tell you next." The door swung open, and before it had fully cleared the frame, Tanner grabbed Darius by the lapel of the Italian wool suit. The suit that had been tailored by a man in Georgetown who charged $1,100 for the privilege and pulled, and Darius stumbled onto the asphalt of Sycamore Court in a movement that was not an arrest, not yet, but was something that had the shape and the weight of one. Darius did not fight it. He went with the momentum, let himself be positioned, and spread his hands flat on the hot metal of the Tahoe's hood. He began speaking in a clear, carrying voice precisely loud enough for the body camera on Tanner's chest to capture every syllable. He was not telling Tanner what to do. He was building a record. "My badge," Darius said, pressing his palms flat against the sun-heated hood of the Tahoe, and keeping his voice at the steady documentary cadence of a man who was simultaneously living through something and archiving it for future use, "is in my left interior jacket pocket. My service weapon is holstered under my left arm. I am not resisting. I am a federal agent on an active operation, and every second of this interaction is being recorded and transmitted to my field office." Tanner had heard none of it, or had chosen to hear none of it, which was its own kind of answer. "Gun," he shouted at a volume that was designed not for Darius, but for the audience that was beginning to materialize on the porches up and down Sycamore Court, the neighbors emerging from their climate-controlled houses with their phones and their cups of coffee to watch whatever was happening on their quiet street. "He's armed, Marsh. Cover me." Casey drew her weapon but angled it toward the pavement, a compromise between following the order and following her own clearly troubled judgment. "Brad." "He told you about the weapon," she said. "He's complying." "Secure the perimeter," Tanner said, which was not a real operational instruction in this context, but sounded like one, and sometimes that was sufficient. 3 houses down from where all of this was happening, at the edge of the Pattersons' driveway, a 10-year-old boy named Leo had stopped his bicycle so abruptly that the rear tire had skidded a half-inch across the sidewalk. Leo lived 2 streets over and rode through Maplewood Estates on his way home from school because the streets were smooth and the traffic was light, and he had turned onto Sycamore Court at exactly the wrong moment, or depending on how you looked at it, exactly the right one. He was small for his age, with a backpack that was almost as big as he was, and he stood with 1 foot on the pedal and 1 foot on the ground, and his eyes moving between the man in the suit with his hands on the car and the officer pressing him down. And his face held the specific expression of a child who has just encountered something that contradicts everything he has been told about how the world is supposed to work. He did not run. He did not look away. Tanner patted Darius down with the thoroughness of a man looking for validation rather than evidence, running his hands along the jacket, the trousers, the belt, and found the Sig Sauer in the shoulder holster and wrenched it free with a kind of triumphant aggression that sent it skidding 3 feet across the asphalt, where it came to rest against the curb with its finish scratched along the barrel. "That is federal property," Darius said, still in the same steady voice, still building the record. "The serial number is registered to the Bureau. Mishandling a federal officer's service weapon is a separate federal charge." Tanner reached into the jacket pocket and pulled out the leather credential wallet. He opened it. The gold FBI shield caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in a way that was, under the circumstances, almost theatrical in its clarity. The photo ID beside the badge was sharp and clean: Darius Webb, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For one full heartbeat, maybe two, there was silence on Sycamore Court. Casey stepped forward and looked at the badge over Tanner's shoulder, and her voice, when it came out, was very quiet and very certain. She told him it was real. She told him to let Darius up. And that was when Darius understood, watching Tanner's face in the fraction of a second before his features rearranged themselves, that this was no longer a story about a bad stop or a hasty judgment or an officer who made an understandable mistake in the heat of the moment. Because Tanner looked at that badge and he knew, and knowing, he made his choice anyway. He snapped the wallet shut. He put it in his own pocket. Tanner turned to face the growing audience with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 2 decades performing authority for civilian crowds, and in a voice that carried clearly to the porches and the driveway and the woman with the phone at number 44 Mrs. Eleanor Holt. 61 years old, retired schoolteacher who had been standing on her porch since the cruiser first crawled past her hydrangeas. He announced that the badge looked like a forgery to him, that these things could be bought online for $30, and that this individual was being detained for impersonating a federal officer. Mrs. Holt kept filming. She had been filming since before Tanner grabbed the door handle, and she did not stop. Across the street, the 3-man landscaping crew had turned off their equipment and stood in a loose cluster near their truck, watching with the careful stillness of people who understood implicitly that whatever was happening on this street was not their fight to involve themselves in, but who were watching anyway with the attentiveness of witnesses who understood that what they were seeing mattered. Darius had gone completely still in a new way now, not the stillness of patience or the stillness of professional composure, but the stillness of a man watching a misdemeanor become a felony, and cataloging every detail with the cold precision of someone who has spent 12 years understanding exactly how evidence works and exactly what it requires. He was aware of the body camera on Tanner's chest. He was aware of his own wire. He was aware of the phones on the porches. He was building a case in real time from the inside of it, and the case was building itself faster than he needed to do anything at all. Tanner pulled his handcuffs and read Darius his rights in the flat, bored cadence of a man who has said these words so many times that they have stopped being words and become a kind of verbal punctuation. And then, leaning close as he clicked the steel around Darius's wrists with his face very near Darius's ear, and his voice dropped below the threshold of the phones on the porches, but still above the threshold of a wire taped to a chest, he said it. Those 5 words. The ones we started with. Darius did not flinch. He did not react. He turned his head very deliberately and looked directly at Casey Marsh, who was standing 4 feet away, and whose face had gone from troubled to something closer to horror, and he said in a clear and carrying voice the number of the federal statute she was currently at risk of violating by failing to intervene. Title 18 United States Code. Section 242, and explained calmly, and without any particular emphasis, what accessory liability looked like in a federal civil rights case. Casey's mouth opened. She looked at Tanner. She looked at Darius. She looked at the badge-shaped bulge in Tanner's shirt pocket. "Brad," she said. "We should run the number. Dispatch can verify it in 10 seconds. "Get him in the car," Marsh Tanner said, and guided Darius toward the cruiser with one hand on the chain of the cuffs, and Darius walked with the straight-backed, unhurried dignity of a man who understood that how he walked in this moment was as important as anything he had said. At the edge of the Pattersons' driveway, Leo watched this one foot still on the pedal, his backpack enormous on his small shoulders, and his face had moved past confusion into something that looked very much like a kind of grieving, the specific grief of a child watching an adult world fail to be what it had promised to be. Inside the cruiser, in the plastic-smelling cage-divided back seat, Darius sat down, straightened himself as much as the confined space allowed, and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he began counting. Leo dropped his bike. He didn't lean it against the curb or set it down carefully. He just let it fall sideways onto the sidewalk with a clatter that nobody on the street noticed, because everyone was watching the cruiser, and he stepped over it and walked to the edge of the driveway and stood there with his arms folded across his chest, in a posture that was for a 10-year-old with a cartoon rocket ship on his backpack, startlingly adult. From the Patterson porch, his mother's voice. Mrs. Angela Patterson, who had come outside when she heard the commotion and had been watching with one hand pressed flat against her sternum as if trying to keep something inside her chest from escaping, called his name once. Leo didn't go back. Tanner was performing for the neighbors now, walking between the cruiser and the Tahoe, with the loose, satisfied energy of a man who had handled a situation and was now enjoying the resolution of it. He picked up Darius's weapon from the curb, handling it carelessly, 2 fingers through the trigger guard, swinging it slightly, and tossed it onto the passenger seat of his cruiser with a sound that made Casey flinch visibly. He turned to the small gathered audience with something close to a smile. Leo looked at the cruiser where Darius was sitting in the back. He looked at his mother on the porch. He looked at Mrs. Holt with her phone still raised, and at the landscaping crew across the street, and at Tanner walking back toward Casey with his chest out and his sunglasses catching the afternoon light. And then, in the clear, carrying voice that children use when they have a genuine question and have not yet learned to be afraid of asking it out loud, the voice that bypasses all of the social calculation that adults use to stay silent in moments like this, Leo said it. He asked why the policeman was arresting the man in the suit when the man in the suit had shown him his badge. It was not an accusation. It was not a challenge. It was exactly what it sounded like, a 10-year-old standing in a driveway with a fallen bicycle behind him, asking a completely reasonable question about something he had watched with his own eyes. The sound it made when it landed on Sycamore Court was extraordinary. Mrs. Holt lowered her phone for just a moment. The landscaping crew shifted, looking at each other. The woman on the porch of number 38, who had been watching with the careful neutrality of someone who didn't want to get involved, looked down at her hands. Casey Marsh looked at Leo, then at the badge in Tanner's pocket, then at the ground, and her jaw moved slightly as if she was working through a sentence she couldn't find the words to finish. Tanner heard it. He did not answer it. He opened the cruiser's rear door, instead glanced at Darius in the back seat, with the brisk dismissiveness of a man who has filed something away and is moving on, and told Casey they were going. Inside the car, Darius heard the question too. He couldn't see Leo from where he was sitting, but he heard the voice, the clarity of it, the uncomplicated logic of it, and something shifted very slightly behind his eyes. He leaned forward until his lips were close to the seam of his collar. He was not praying. He was not panicking. He was making a calculation, and the calculation was already complete because this situation had stopped being complicated approximately 45 seconds after Tanner pocketed the badge. Darius knew something that Brad Tanner, currently settling into the driver's seat with the satisfied weight of a man who had won, did not know. In a voice barely above a breath, pitched precisely for the microphone taped to his chest, Darius said 2 words. "Serena. Now." 2 blocks east of Sycamore Court, parked between a landscaper's trailer and a minivan in the shade of an oak tree that had been growing in the same spot for 60 years. A white panel van sat with its engine off and its side door cracked 2 inches for ventilation. Inside, Special Agent Serena Okafor had been listening to every word of the last 14 minutes through a pair of over-ear monitors, and her expression had traveled a considerable distance in that time, from the focused neutrality of a surveillance professional to something considerably tighter and more purposeful. She was 38 years old, originally from Lagos by way of Howard University and the FBI Academy at Quantico, and she had a gift for remaining very still when everything around her was moving too fast, which was useful in her line of work and was serving her extremely well right now. She had heard the declaration of credentials. She had heard the refusal. She had heard the handcuffs and the charges and the slur. She had heard the slur clearly enough that she had instinctively reached up and adjusted the gain on her receiver, even though it did not need adjusting, and she had transmitted all of it in real time to the D.C. field office, where ASAC Diane Fowler had been listening to the live feed from her glass-walled office and had begun making phone calls approximately 30 seconds after the badge went into Tanner's pocket. The federal machinery, once it begins moving, is not a fast thing, but it had 14 minutes of head start, and by the time Darius whispered Serena's name into his wire, it had already reached the speed of inevitability. Serena pressed the transmit button on her radio. Back on Sycamore Court, Tanner was performing his final act for the neighborhood. He had walked back toward Mrs. Holt and the small gathered cluster of porch watchers and told them in the booming, authoritative voice of a man who had never questioned his own authority that there was nothing to see here and that he was simply doing his job. He told them that the streets of Maplewood Estates were safe because of officers like himself who took the time to investigate suspicious vehicles before problems developed. Leo, still standing at the edge of the driveway, arms still folded, watched him say this. Tanner had not noticed Leo, particularly a kid on a bike, irrelevant background, but Leo had been watching Tanner with the specific, unblinking attention that children bring to things that don't make sense to them and that they are trying to understand. He watched Tanner's hands. He watched the bulge in the pocket where the badge was. He watched the way Tanner smiled for the neighbors, and the way that smile did not extend past the edges of his mouth. Inside the cruiser, Casey sat in the driver's seat with the car in park and her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the rearview mirror, which was angled such that she could see Darius in the back seat if she chose to look, and she had been choosing to look repeatedly in the way that people look at something they are trying to come to terms with. She put the car into drive. Her foot moved toward the gas pedal. The dashboard clock read 2:21 p.m. And then, from directly in front of the cruiser, there came a sound. It was a single sharp, aggressive chirp, not the distant rise and fall of an ambulance, not the rolling wail of a passing fire truck, but the short, commanding whoop-whoop of a federal law enforcement vehicle announcing its presence with the specific clipped authority of something that does not need to ask for your attention because it already has it. Casey's foot came off the gas before it had even pressed down. The large black Suburban came around the corner of Sycamore Court with the kind of controlled, deliberate speed that communicates absolute confidence, no drama, no theater, no squealing tires. Because squealing tires are for people who aren't sure if they're going to stop where they intended, and it positioned itself directly across the width of the street in front of the cruiser with a precision that made it clear this maneuver had been practiced and refined and was not improvised. The grille lights erupted in red and blue, flooding the clean suburban street with color that felt entirely wrong for a Tuesday afternoon, in a neighborhood where the most excitement was usually someone's sprinkler system cycling on past curfew. Before Tanner had fully registered the first Suburban, the second came from behind. The sound of its tires was very close. It stopped 6 feet off the rear bumper of the cruiser, close enough that Casey could read the license plate in her rearview mirror, close enough that the exit that way was not an option. Then the third coming in from the side street at the north end of the cul-de-sac, completing the box. The doors opened, and the people who came out of them moved the way that federal tactical teams move, not fast in a frantic way, but fast in the deeply unsettling way of people who have done this so many times that every step is exactly where it's supposed to be. Every hand position is deliberate. Every sight line is covered before the person covering it has consciously made the decision. They wore heavy plate carriers with FBI in large yellow letters across the front and the back, and they held their weapons in the low ready position barrels angled at the asphalt, ready to snap up in a fraction of a second. There were at least 14 of them visible from the cruiser, and the people watching from the porches of Sycamore Court had gone very quiet in a way that was different from the earlier quiet. This was not the silence of uncertainty. This was the silence of people understanding that something much larger than a traffic stop had just arrived on their street. Tanner sat in the driver's seat and did not move. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, the same position Darius noted from the back seat, with the dry, private recognition of a man who appreciates a certain kind of irony that Darius himself had been in when all of this started. A voice came over the PA from the lead suburban, unhurried, clear, the voice of someone who has said this many times and knows exactly what happens next. Driver of the police cruiser. Turn off the engine. Throw the keys out the window. Keep your hands visible. Tanner's head moved slightly, tracking the agents visible through the windshield, the ones visible in the side mirror, the ones behind him. His mouth was forming words, but they had no sound behind them. In the back seat, Darius watched the sweat begin at Tanner's hairline, watched it beat up at the edge of that platinum buzz cut. And after 14 minutes of enforced stillness and cold calculation, and the particular discipline of a man who refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him shaken, Darius allowed himself one long, quiet exhale through his nose. He leaned forward toward the cage. "I'd listen to them, Brad," he said. Tanner stepped out of the cruiser on shaking legs, and the afternoon light that had been so ordinary 20 minutes ago hit him with a quality that felt different now, exposing instead of illuminating. He interlaced his fingers on top of his head and walked backward on the instruction from the PA, and the neighbors on the porches of Sycamore Court watched him do it. He was put on his knees on the same asphalt where he had put Darius's knee, and flex cuffs were applied to his wrists with the same quick efficiency that Tanner himself used when he cuffed people, and when he said they were too tight, the agent behind him said with no particular emotion, "Quiet," and that was the end of that conversation. Casey was out of the car before anyone asked her to be. Her hands were already up, and she was already talking, telling the nearest agent everything in the urgent, grateful rush of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing and has finally been given permission to set it down. SAC Diane Fowler walked through the perimeter tape. She had arrived in a dark sedan while the tactical team was executing the box maneuver, and she moved through the controlled chaos of the scene with the contained authority of someone who had spent 22 years earning the right to walk exactly like that. She stopped in front of Tanner, looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Tanner's voice filled the quiet Sycamore Court afternoon. The instructions to get out of the car. The refusal to look at credentials. And then clearly, unmistakably in Tanner's own voice, at the reduced volume of something meant to be private, but recorded anyway, those 5 words. Mrs. Holt lowered her phone for a moment, then raised it again. The landscaping crew, which had moved incrementally closer over the course of the last 20 minutes in the way of people who feel compelled to witness something, stood very still. Leo was still at the edge of the driveway. He had not moved from that spot since he dropped his bike, and he watched Tanner kneeling on the asphalt with the recorder playing his own words back at him, and then Leo looked toward the cruiser where the rear door was now opening. Darius stepped out. He rubbed his wrists where the red marks from the handcuffs were already deepening into proper bruises. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his lapels, a small private act of restoration, and he walked to where Tanner was kneeling. He didn't perform it. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood in front of the man who had called him boy and looked at him with the expression of someone who is not angry exactly, but is very, very tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who has had this same confrontation in different rooms on different streets in different cities for more years than he can easily count. Leo exhaled. His small shoulders dropped with the complete physical relief of a child who had been holding his breath without realizing it, and who has just discovered that the story was not going to end the wrong way after all. Darius walked Tanner through it without drama in the same patient, factual voice he used when briefing congressional staff members who didn't understand how federal investigations actually worked. He told him about the 18 months. He told him about the wire intercepts and the financial forensics and the rezoning contracts. He pointed up the street at Alderman Crane's colonial house 3 doors up where the lights had just gone off, and he told him that the courier who was supposed to deliver the cash that would have closed the entire case had turned around 3 blocks back when he drove past the cruiser and the lights and the growing cluster of vehicles and had not come back. Tanner said nothing. He was looking at the house. "The man you have been protecting," Darius said. And he kept his voice level because this was not the moment for anger. "Every time you kept cars like mine out of this neighborhood, every time you made sure this street stayed quiet and undisturbed, that man has been poisoning this city for 5 years. He has been washing cartel money through construction contracts that put fentanyl on streets where people's children live. You were his security guard, Brad. You just didn't know who was paying for the service." Tanner's face was doing something complicated. Darius touched his earpiece. Special Agent Serena Okafor had already run the calculation from the surveillance van and reached the same conclusion they had probable cause from the existing wiretaps. The disruption Tanner had caused qualified as exigent circumstances, and the lights going off in Crane's house meant they had a very short window before a man who had survived for 5 years by being extremely careful decided to become extremely difficult to find. "Crane is running?" Darius said to Fowler, who had appeared at his elbow with the focused urgency of someone who has also just done this calculation. "He's in the study. That's where the shredder is." Fowler was already on her radio. While the tactical team reformed at the edge of the street, a tech agent appeared at Darius's shoulder holding a tablet and wearing an expression that suggested he had found something interesting on Tanner's cruiser laptop. Something interesting enough that he wanted to show Darius before they moved on Crane's house. "He wasn't running your plates through the state database," the tech agent said. Darius looked at the tablet screen. Then he looked at Tanner, still kneeling on the asphalt with the flex cuffs behind him, watching the tactical team move up toward the alderman's house, with the hollow, stranded expression of a man watching the entire framework of his professional identity dismantle itself in real time. "What is the Watchman server?" Darius asked. Tanner closed his eyes. What Brad Tanner had done at 2:06 p.m. that afternoon when he first spotted the black Tahoe with the government plates sitting on Sycamore Court was not run the plate number through the state law enforcement database the way that departmental protocol required. What he had done instead was open the encrypted Discord server on his cruiser's laptop, the one called The Watchman, accessible only with a credential that had been given to him personally by Lieutenant Dale Forsyth, his direct supervisor approximately 14 months earlier, and he had posted the plate number and a photograph of Darius's car with the question, "Got a target at 12 Sycamore. Nice car, wrong profile for the neighborhood. Anyone know this plate?" The response had come back in less than 4 minutes from a user with the handle Ridge. "That's a clean tag. Civilian registration front. Could be a spook. Light him up, see what shakes out." The tech agent had already cloned the laptop's drive by the time Darius was looking at the chat log, and what the full log revealed, scrolling back through 14 months of activity, was not the record of one officer making a bad call on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the record of an organized, deliberate operation running inside the Maplewood Police Department and at least 2 neighboring jurisdictions through which a rotating group of 41 officers shared suspect profiles. Coordinated targeted stops, ran informal competitions on ticket volumes, and received instructions from Ridge on which vehicles and individuals to prioritize for engagement. The targets, Darius noted as he scrolled, were not random. They followed a pattern that would have been recognizable to anyone who had spent time studying how these arrangements develop and persist: the same neighborhoods, the same profile descriptors, the same language, the same outcome. The Watchman server was not a group of rogue officers operating in isolation. It was infrastructure. Chief Gary Elson of the Maplewood Police Department arrived under the yellow tape at approximately 2:41 p.m., looking like a man who had aged several years in the time it took him to drive 4 blocks from the precinct. He was in his early 60s, with the careful, measured bearing of a politician who had spent 30 years managing the gap between what he knew and what he could afford to acknowledge knowing, and he walked toward ASAC Fowler with his hand already extended in the reflex of a man who has always been able to smooth things over with a handshake and a reasonable tone. Fowler did not take the hand. Darius walked him through the chat logs instead, page by page, screen by screen, and watched the chief's face make its journey from practiced skepticism to genuine alarm to something that in a more honest man would have been shame. But in Chief Elson arrived more as the specific terror of someone realizing that the thing he thought was contained has been visible to other people for quite some time. "We are seizing all departmental servers," Fowler told him. "We are seizing personal devices of every officer who had access to this channel. We are opening a pattern of practice investigation into the Maplewood PD under Title 34 of the U.S. Code effective this afternoon." She paused. "And if we find in the course of that investigation that command-level personnel were aware of this server and chose not to act on that awareness, that becomes a separate and significantly more serious matter." Elson was looking at his shoes. Darius handed the tablet back to the tech agent and looked up the street toward Crane's house, where the tactical team was already stacked against the white siding, breaching tools in position. The front lights were still off. Somewhere inside that expensive colonial house, a man who had built his entire careful life on the assumption that the people around him would always look away at the right moment was making decisions that would determine whether the next decade of his life was spent in that house or in a federal facility. "The server matters," Darius said to Fowler, "but the hard drive is what takes down the cartel connection." He rolled his shoulders, checked his vest, and started up the driveway. "FBI search warrant." Darius's voice hit the front door of Crane's colonial house like something physical, deep and carrying and deliberate in its projection. This was the voice that said, "We are here, and we are not leaving, and the next sound you hear will be a great deal louder than this one. Open the door. Now." The silence from inside the house lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Serena, who had joined the team from the surveillance van, said, "Hit it," and the battering ram connected with the door in a single swing that sent it inward in a cascade of splintered oak and scattered hardware that had probably cost more at the mill workshop than most people spent on their first car. They moved through the foyer in 2 columns, the practiced, fluid movement of people who had drilled this until it stopped being thought and became instinct. A maid in the kitchen screamed and dropped to the floor between the marble counter and the island, and an agent secured her gently and told her she was safe and to stay down. The main floor was clear in 40 seconds. Darius moved toward the back of the house, toward the heavy double doors of the study, because that was where Victor Crane kept his ledgers, and that was where the shredder was, and that was where a careful man who had suddenly run out of time would go. The doors were locked. Serena didn't reach for the battering ram. She used a mule kick flat of her boot directly below the handle, and the latch snapped and the doors swung inward, and the first thing Darius registered was the smell. Smoke. Paper smoke. The specific smell of burning documents. Crane was standing at the fireplace in a silk bathrobe, and the metal wastebasket beside him was actively on fire, and the thick ledger in his hands, the kind with the marbled cover and the sewn binding that accountants used before everything moved to software. The kind you keep when you need the record to be analog and invisible, was already half fed into the flames. He looked up when the doors came open, and his face in the firelight was extraordinary. The wild, cornered panic of a man who had spent 5 years believing this moment would never arrive, and was now confronting the fact that it had arrived much faster than he could have possibly managed. FBI. Step away from the fire. Darius moved across the study in 4 strides, but Crane's arm was already moving the black external hard drive and his left hand swinging toward the flames. Darius lunged. He did not go for Crane. He went for the evidence. His gloved hand closed around the hard drive in the air 3 inches from the mouth of the fireplace, and he felt the heat climb his wrist immediately. Sharp, serious heat, but he held on and pulled back, and the drive came with him, and not with the fire. Serena hit Crane with a tackle that was entirely professional and entirely effective, and the alderman went down onto the Persian rug with the wind evacuated completely from his body. And by the time he had gathered enough breath to say that he had rights and that he was an elected official, his wrists were already secured behind him. Darius dumped a vase of flowers over the wastebasket. The fire hissed into wet, smoking silence. Half-burnt pages sat in the bottom, damaged but readable. He bagged them. They walked Crane out the front door 6 minutes after they went in, and as they emerged into the afternoon light, Crane saw the police cruiser still parked at the end of the street, and he saw Brad Tanner's face in the rear window of the FBI Suburban, and his voice when it came out was cracked and disbelieving and directed entirely at Tanner. "You idiot," Crane said. "You led them straight to me." The interrogation room in the FBI's regional field office was cold, in the way that interrogation rooms are always cold. Not the accidental cold of a malfunctioning HVAC system, but the deliberate cold of a controlled environment maintained at 64 degrees to keep the occupant uncomfortable and awake, and acutely aware of the fact that their physical comfort is now dependent on other people's decisions. The table was bolted to the floor. The walls were gray acoustic foam. The light was flat and humless and gave everything in the room the washed-out quality of something that has already been archived. Brad Tanner had been sitting in that room for 3 hours when the door opened, and when he looked up expecting his union lawyer, a man named Victor Holt, who represented the Fraternal Order of Police in cases exactly like this one, and who charged the union $400 an hour for the privilege he found. Instead, that the door had been opened by Darius Webb, who set a thick folder on the table without greeting and sat down across from him, and behind Darius came A.S.A. C. Fowler, who remained standing with her back to the wall and her arms at her sides. Tanner asked about Holt. Darius told him without any particular emphasis that the Fraternal Order of Police had held an emergency review that afternoon and had voted by a margin that was apparently not particularly close to revoke Tanner's membership and his access to union legal coverage. The wire recording the body cam footage, the chat logs from the Watchman server they had determined with the brisk self-protective logic of an institution trying to save itself that Tanner's conduct fell within the category of intentional criminal behavior that voided his coverage under the contract. The blue wall, Darius did not say, but did not need to, had reviewed the situation and decided that Brad Tanner was someone it could no longer afford to know. Tanner sat with this information for a long moment. Something in his posture changed not all at once, but gradually the way a building settles into the ground over years, rather than collapsing the slow downward adjustment of a man who has spent his entire professional life inside an institution, and is now understanding what it means to be outside of one. Darius opened the folder. The chat logs were on top, printed, annotated, highlighted. 41 users. 14 months of activity. The full record of the Watchman server decrypted and cataloged. He told Tanner what he was facing, deprivation of rights under federal statute, assault on a federal officer, mishandling of federal property, conspiracy to violate civil rights in coordination with a documented network of officers. He said the word conspiracy with the same flat neutrality he used for every other word because it was not a word he needed to dramatize. The weight of it was already doing its work on Tanner's face. Then he slid the cooperation agreement across the table. Tanner looked at it. He looked at the chat logs. He looked at Darius, and then at Fowler, and then at the surface of the table, and then in a voice that was very quiet and had lost all of its former architectural confidence. He said that if he talked, he was a snitch. He said that a cop in general population was one thing, and a cop who had snitched was something considerably worse, and that he would not last a week. Darius looked at him steadily. "Tell me about Ridge," he said. Darius did not threaten him. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid out the mathematics of the two roads in front of Brad Tanner with the patient factual clarity of a man who has done this enough times to know that threats are less persuasive than arithmetic, and that most people, when they can see the numbers clearly enough, eventually choose the path that keeps them alive. Then Tanner asked something he hadn't asked before, something that came out in a quieter register than everything else he'd said, with the hesitant quality of a question the asker is not entirely sure they want answered. He asked whether Darius had actually been afraid out there on the street. Not pretending. Actually afraid. Darius was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer it honestly. Then he said that no, not personally, not that afternoon, not with a wire running to the field office and a tactical team 2 blocks away. But he said something else too, and he said it looking directly at Tanner without any anger in it. Just the weight of the thing itself the man before him had been. And the one before that. And the one before that. Men who had been pulled over on the same kind of quiet street on the same kind of afternoon with no wire and no team and no badge of their own, and who had met an officer with Tanner's chest-forward posture and Tanner's pre-made conclusions and had no mechanism to make it stop. Tanner stared at the table. "You weren't an accident," Brad Darius said. "You were a pattern. And Ridge built the infrastructure that let the pattern keep going. The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before it." When Tanner finally spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who has spent a long time being certain about things, and has run out of certainty and is standing in what remains, and what remains is not very much. He gave the name. Ridge was Lieutenant Dale Forsythe, Tanner's direct supervisor. 14-year veteran of the Maplewood PD, the man who had built the Watchman server, who had recruited officers from 3 departments who had assigned the handle Ridge to himself after the Ridge in a military formation, the elevated position from which you direct the movement of everyone below you. The man who had given Tanner his login credentials and told him in the casual offhand way of a senior officer mentoring a junior one that this was how you kept the good neighborhoods clean. Fowler stepped away from the wall and moved toward the door without a word, which was all the communication necessary. By the time Darius stood up and gathered his files, she was already on her phone, and the warrant for Forsythe was already being drafted. Darius looked at Tanner one final time before he knocked on the door for the guard. He told him that what he had just done was the right thing, and that it was not sufficient to undo what had happened on Sycamore Court, but that it was enough to keep him alive. He said this without cruelty and without comfort, because neither was what the moment called for. It called for truth. 3 floors below the interrogation room, where Tanner was being processed in a smaller room with a different quality of fluorescent light and a table that was not bolted to the floor, Casey Marsh had been writing her statement for 2 hours, and she had not stopped once or asked to pause or requested clarification on any of the questions put to her because there was nothing in what she had witnessed that was ambiguous enough to require clarification. She had written everything. The cruiser pulling onto Sycamore Court, the way Tanner stepped out before the car had fully stopped, the declaration of federal credentials, the door handle, the badge in the pocket, every instruction she had given that Tanner had overridden, every moment where the situation could have been redirected toward a different outcome by a different choice, and where the different choice had not been made. She did not spare herself either. She had said, maybe let him show the ID first, and then had not pushed further, and she wrote that down with the same unflinching accuracy she applied to everything else, because this was not the moment for self-protective editing. She had also, before the statement was finished, submitted a request for a voluntary transfer out of the Maplewood Police Department. Not under investigation, not under any compulsion, voluntarily. Because she had understood at some point in the last several hours that she could not be effective in a department that would need to be rebuilt from the inside out, and that her presence there while the investigation was ongoing would be neither useful nor honest. When she came out of the room, her statement complete and signed, Darius was in the hallway. They stood for a moment, not awkwardly exactly, but with the particular gravity of two people on opposite sides of something enormous, who recognize that they are in their different ways trying to find the same shore. Casey said that she should have stopped it sooner, that she had seen the badge was real and she had said maybe and then retreated, and that the difference between saying maybe and actually stopping something was the exact difference that mattered. Darius looked at her. He was tired in the way that people are tired after a day that has contained a great deal more than a standard day should be asked to contain. But he was still present in the way that good agents and good people remain present even when they are tired. He told her that he had listened to the wire recording, and that her voice on that recording he told you he has a badge was the piece that had clarified the timeline for Fowler and accelerated the decision to move. That, without that sentence on the tape, the case against Tanner was 4 minutes slower to build. You stopped it when it counted, he said. Casey nodded. It was not absolution, and she understood it wasn't meant to be. But it was a true thing, and there was something solid in a true thing, something you could stand on when the ground beneath everything else had recently turned out to be less reliable than advertised. She picked up her jacket and walked toward the exit, and Darius watched her go, and then he went to find a cup of coffee that was actually hot. 6 months is a long time when you are living inside it, and a very short time when you are watching someone else's life complete its arc. The federal courthouse downtown on a Thursday morning in November had the quality of a stage set waiting for the final act. The news vans in a row along the curb, their satellite dishes pointed at a sky the color of old pewter. The reporters doing their stand-ups on the courthouse steps with the brick facade behind them. The scrolling text on the news van's exterior monitor reading, Maplewood Police Corruption Trial, Sentencing Today. Darius arrived 40 minutes early and drank his coffee on the steps and watched the city begin its day around the edges of the circus. Serena was beside him, saying very little in the companionable way of two people who have been in close quarters during difficult things and have learned each other's silences. A SAC Fowler was inside already at the prosecution table doing whatever it is prosecutors and their federal counterparts do in the hour before a sentencing, when everything is already decided and the preparation is mostly about posture. Inside the courtroom, Brad Tanner was already seated at the defense table. Darius looked at him when he came in and registered with the objective attention he applied to everything the degree to which 6 months in federal custody had worked on the man. The platinum buzz cut had grown out into something undecided. He had lost weight in the way that people lose weight when they are not eating well, rather than when they are eating healthfully. The barrel chest had softened, and the posture that had been on Sycamore Court, the central communicative instrument of his authority, that forward-leading space-claiming posture, had folded in on itself into something considerably smaller. In the front row of the gallery, Tanner's ex-wife sat beside a man in a dark suit who was not there for emotional support. She had the careful stillness of someone who has already grieved what they needed to grieve and arrived at the courthouse today to attend to paperwork rather than feelings. Judge Yvonne Hargrove entered, and the room stood and sat at her instruction, and she adjusted her glasses and looked at her papers, and then looked at Tanner with the measured, unsentimental attention of a judge who has spent enough years on the bench to have stopped being surprised by the ways in which people with power choose to misuse it. She acknowledged his cooperation. She acknowledged the indictments that his testimony had enabled Lieutenant Dale Forsyth, currently awaiting trial, and 2 other officers across 2 departments currently in custody. She acknowledged that the information he had provided had been instrumental in the dismantling of a network that had operated embedded in the institutional culture of 3 law enforcement agencies for the better part of 4 years. "The court recognizes this," Judge Hargrove said. However, she let the word sit on its own for a moment. "You were not an unwilling participant who stumbled into something larger than yourself. The evidence presented in this matter shows that you were an enthusiastic and proactive member of this network. You escalated an interaction with a decorated federal officer not out of confusion or fear, but out of arrogance. You saw the badge. You made a choice." She looked at Darius at the prosecution table. "Agent Cross, the court will now hear your victim impact statement." Darius stood. He did not have notes. He had thought about what he wanted to say for 6 months, and not once during those 6 months had he felt the need to write it down, because it was not the kind of thing that required writing. It was the kind of thing you either understand or you don't, and the only way to say it clearly was to say it directly. He walked to the podium. Walked to the "Your Honor," Darius said, and his voice in the federal courtroom carried with the same even unhurried quality it had carried on Sycamore Court and in the interrogation room, and in every place in the last 6 months where he had been required to say difficult things in front of people who needed to hear them. "I want to talk about someone who wasn't in that courtroom 6 months ago and who isn't in this one today." He paused. The room was very quiet. "I am a trained federal agent. I have spent 12 years learning how to manage exactly the kind of situation I found myself in on Sycamore Court. I knew the statute. I knew the protocol. I was wearing a wire. I had a team 2 blocks away. When Officer Tanner escalated that interaction, I had every tool available to me to ensure that it ended in documentation rather than tragedy." He looked at the courtroom, at the gallery, at the press section, at Fowler, at Serena, at Judge Hargrove. Then he looked at Tanner. "But I keep thinking about the people who came before me on streets like that one. The teenager driving home from his after-school job who doesn't know the statute and doesn't have a wire and can't cite Title 18 in a clear voice while someone is pressing him against the hood of a car. The father taking the long way home from the grocery store because he likes the quiet streets, who has done nothing wrong and has no mechanism to make that fact matter to the officer, who has already decided otherwise before he even steps out of the cruiser. The grandfather who fits someone's description of something that didn't happen. All of those people." He let the silence have its moment. They didn't have a backup team. They didn't have 16 years of federal training telling them exactly what to say and exactly how to say it. They had their own dignity and whatever courage they could hold on to in a moment designed to take both of those things away from them. When they met an officer like Brad Tanner, they had no one listening. They had no wire. They had no cavalry coming. He glanced toward the gallery. In the second row, Angela Patterson, Leo's mother, sat with her son beside her. She had brought him because she had decided in the careful and deliberate way of a parent making an important decision about what her child should understand about the world that he deserved to see how this ended. Leo was sitting with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the podium, very still, wearing the same backpack. Darius saw him and held his gaze for just a moment before continuing. "Justice worked today," Darius said, "because I happen to be part of the institution that administers it. And that is the precise problem, not the solution. Justice should not require a federal badge to reach a black man on a residential street. It should not require a wire or a tactical team or 12 years of training to be treated as what you actually are, a person deserving of basic professional dignity from the people who are paid by the public to extend it." He looked directly at Tanner one last time. Officer Tanner did not just break a law in Sycamore Court. He broke a promise. The promise that makes it possible for people to believe that the institutions meant to protect them are actually in some meaningful and reliable way trying to do that. That promise is not a small thing. It is the thing that holds the rest of it together. And when it is broken, the repair takes much longer than 6 months. He stepped back from the podium. He walked back to his seat. In the gallery, Leo unfolded his hands and looked down at them quietly the way a child does when something very large has just been said and has landed somewhere deep and permanent inside them. Judge Hargrove looked at her papers for a moment that felt longer than it was in the way that moments of consequence sometimes expand to accommodate the weight of what they contain. Richard Bradley Tanner. She said, "This court sentences you to 46 months in federal prison to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from any employment in law enforcement, private security, or any capacity that would grant you legal authority over other persons. Your pension is stripped in its entirety. Remand is immediate." The gavel came down. It was a clean, definitive sound, not loud but absolute, and it moved through the courtroom the way that certain sounds do less heard than felt. Tanner rose. The marshals moved in from either side, and he stood between them with his arms coming behind his back, and the handcuffs closed around his wrists with the same sound that had defined the worst moment of Darius Webb's Tuesday afternoon 6 months ago, that particular click familiar and final. Tanner looked around the courtroom as they began to walk him toward the side door, and his eyes moved through the gallery and across the press section and past his ex-wife and came to rest for one moment on Darius. There was no anger in Darius's face, no satisfaction, no residue of the day on Sycamore Court. What was there was simply the professional absence of anything personal, the expression of a man who has filed something correctly and is ready to move on to the next file. Tanner held the gaze for 2 or 3 seconds, and then the marshals moved him along, and the side door opened, and he was gone. In the gallery, Leo watched the door close behind Tanner. Then he turned to his mother and said something very quietly in the private voice. Children reserve for things that feel too significant for full volume, and Angela Patterson put her arm around her son and held him there without answering in words, because some things don't need words, and this was one of them. Darius gathered his folder from the prosecution table. Serena was beside him, and she said the thing she had been holding since that morning, which was that he had done well, which coming from Serena was a considerable statement. He thanked her. They walked out of the courtroom together, and through the corridor, and out the front doors of the courthouse into the cold November morning. A cluster of reporters moved toward him calling his name. He stopped at the edge of the steps. He looked into the cameras. If you enjoy stories about justice and accountability, please subscribe to our channel. These stories matter, and the people who lived them deserve to be heard. Then he said the one thing he had come to the microphones to say: respect is not a courtesy, it's the foundation. Build it or watch everything collapse. He stepped back. He and Serena walked into the crowd, and the city swallowed them whole. Lieutenant Dale Forsyth was arrested 11 days after Tanner's sentencing at his home on a Sunday morning, still in the clothes he had slept in. The Watchman server was dismantled within the week, and 14 officers across 3 departments were placed under federal investigation. Alderman Victor Crane was convicted on racketeering and money laundering charges 4 months later, and the cartel money trail was traced back through 4 years of city construction contracts, eventually reaching 3 separate shell companies and 2 offshore accounts. Chief Gary Elson submitted his resignation on the same morning the federal consent decree for the Maplewood PD was formally announced: mandatory retraining, independent civilian oversight, a complete overhaul of stop and frisk policy and body cam protocols. He did not give a statement. Casey Marsh transferred to the county sheriff's office, and within a year was leading their community liaison program. The program that specifically trained new officers on de-escalation and the importance of verification before escalation, a curriculum she wrote herself in part during the months between Sycamore Court and Tanner's sentencing. Mrs. Eleanor Holt's footage aired on 3 national networks the night of the arrest. She never sought attention for it. When a reporter called to ask why she had filmed it, she said a child had asked a question and deserved an honest answer, and that seemed like a sufficient reason. 1 year later, Leo Patterson stood in front of his 5th grade class and delivered a presentation on civil rights. He did not mention Darius Webb by name. He talked about what happens when one person refuses to move and the truth has nowhere left to hide. Darius closed the Crane case with a commendation from the director and declined to speak at the press conference, giving the microphone to Serena Okafor instead. He was back in his car the following Tuesday, different city, different street, same black Tahoe, same Italian wool suit concealing the same service weapon. A new folder on the passenger seat with a new name on the tab. The coffee was already going cold. He settled into the particular stillness he had spent 12 years building the patience of a man who understands that the work is never finished, only transferred from one file to the next, and he watched the street, and he waited, and the city moved around him the way cities do, indifferent and enormous, and full of stories still waiting for someone patient enough to sit still and find them.